Hello, everyone. I'm İhsan Yılmaz from Deakin University, but also ECPS, European Center for Populism Studies. And this is the last of our Sharp Power Talks or seminar series. Last week, we looked at Russia's influence operations and sharp power in the Balkans. And today, we will have a wider coverage. We will be looking at China's Belt and Road initiatives, soft power, sharp power, and actually there are not clear demarcations between these two, and also hard power. So there are some overlaps. So Professor Ibrahim Ozturk will be looking at this dimension, and also we have İmdat Öner, who is an expert on Latin America. So he'll be looking at the Chinese sharp power operations on that part of the world. So in terms of geographical coverage, we will have a very rich empirical aspect in today's talk. And first we'll start with Ibrahim Ozturk, but before starting, let me read his biography. It's normally a much longer one, but I'll just read a shorter version. Ibrahim Ozturk, Professor Ibrahim Ozturk, is a visiting fellow at the University of Duisburg-Essen since 2017. He's studying developmental, institutional, and international economics. His research focused on the Japanese, Turkish, and Chinese economies. Actually, I remember meeting him about 2 decades ago in Japan. He was also visiting scholar in Tokyo, working on Japanese economy. Currently, he's working on emerging hybrid governance models and the rise of populism in the emerging market economies. As part of that interest, he studies the institutional quality of China's modern Silk Road project, the Belt and Road Initiative, its governance model, and implications for the global system. He also teaches courses on business and entrepreneurship in the emerging market economies, such as BRICS main countries. His PhD thesis is on the rise and decline of Japan's developmental institutions in the post-Second World War II era. He has worked at different public and private universities between 1992 and 2016 in Istanbul, Turkey. In 1998, he worked as a visiting fellow at Keio University in Tokyo. So more than 2 decades ago, about 24 years ago, I met him there. And again in 2003 at Tokyo University. He has also been a visiting fellow at Jethro Aiken at North American University in Houston, Texas, and in Duisburg, Germany at the University of Duisburg-Essen. He is one of the founders of the Istanbul Japan Research Association and the Asian Studies Center of Bosphorus University. He has served as a consultant to business associations and companies for many years. He has also been a columnist and TV commentator. His native language is Turkish. He's fluent in English, intermediate in German, and lower intermediate in Japanese. Over to you, Professor Ozturk.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And also, I would like to appreciate your efforts in organizing those power politics of Russia and China. If you don't mind, I would like to share my screen with you. Can I do that?
Yes, please.
So let me tell you that this is the part of my ongoing research on Chinese economic development and Belt and Road Initiative in many parts of the world. So I am not expert on sharp power politics, but while working on Belt and Road Initiative, I have realized that China has been using that kind of policies to create influence in other partner countries. So I would like to share my some part of my ongoing research on the topic. But my screen is a little bit bigger right now, so I cannot see the entire picture. Yes, I can share with you, but I cannot see myself. Anyway, since in this series of talk, many experts have already discussed the term sharp power politics from different perspectives. I'm not going to talk about that longer from the perspective of, let's say, theory. But just I would like to borrow some definition of sharp power so that I can utilize it in my presentation on China. So
We
I
can't see,
understand.
Professor Ozturk, we can't see your PowerPoint right now. Can you
Really?
stop sharing and share again?
Okay.
Maybe it may help.
Right now you cannot see that, right?
Yeah, which is
Okay.
normal because you stopped sharing. If you can share it again.
Okay.
Yes, now we can see it. Perfect.
Good. Just I'm going to borrow some definitions of sharp power so that I can utilize it in my presentation on China. So my understanding of sharp power is that it is to get others to want you want indeed. So in order to convince others to do what you want, of course, authoritarian regimes use influence. Of course, especially in the case of China, authoritarian regimes, Chinese government takes advantage of the existing asymmetry between free Western world and unfree Chinese system to limit free expression and distort political environments in democracies. Simultaneously, they shield China, their countries from outside through censorship and manipulation and undermining the integrity of the independent institutions in their own countries. But when we focus on China from the viewpoint of sharp power, I would like to start with Deng Xiaoping, then move on Hu Jintao, and finally focus on Xi Jinping's policies. Then I will move on Belt and Road Initiative implementations, and I will conclude with a few remarks on the entire topic. So as we know, Deng Xiaoping was a pro soft power politics, because he did not want China to take leadership anywhere in the world. He recommended that the Chinese should quietly observe, secure the position of China in the world, and keep calm, hide aspirations of China, also hide the capacity of China, and China should wait for the proper time. So the key term is that China should wait for the proper time. Until that proper stage arrives, China should keep a low profile, and China should never claim a leadership. The message is that for the time being, China should be modest, but at the right time, China would change that position. This is the message I got from Deng Xiaoping, who took the leadership after Mao in China at early 1980s. I have seen a Chinese saying that a mountain grows with its foothills, meaning that when China becomes a superpower, there will be some unavoidable implications of such a rising great power, of course. And indeed, we can see that perspective in Xi Jinping's remarks. He recommended that China should enhance culture and system of socialist core values with Chinese characteristics, develop and manage internet culture, and promote patriotism, collectivism, and socialist ideology. So the term here is that we should propagate China culture and Chinese system, the core values of socialism, but not a standard textbook-oriented socialism, but it should reflect Chinese way of doing things. So from those two perspectives, I have tried to reach out a formula. So when I combine Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao, and then I will continue on Xi Jinping, and according to their perspective, a sharp power should include soft power when it is needed, hard power, and plus smart power. And Xi Jinping, from that perspective, in my understanding, Xi Jinping is a combination of Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao. Deng Xiaoping started with modesty. Hu Jintao started with the dissemination of socialist system with Chinese characteristics. And indeed, those two perspectives can be followed in Xi Jinping's approach to the situation. With the rise of China as a superpower, we see China tree school. With Xi Jinping, of course, China became second largest economy, second defense force globally. And Chinese system based on interesting combination of capitalism and communism, which is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Xi Jinping made him a president for life, so he removed time restriction, period restriction for himself. So if he can manage the situation, indeed he could manage just a couple of months ago, and he became again a president of China with a very strong show of power again. Also capacities to contest the rule-based international order. When he wants, he can cooperate. When he doesn't want, he can challenge the existing global rules. Of course, there is a massive propagation and information control machinery established in China with the help of public companies and, of course, Communist Party system. And, of course, China has a very large worldwide diaspora to disseminate Chinese perspective globally. The Chinese instruments to employ sharp power include political power, of course, coercion, the use of culture, language centers, and religious propagation, media manipulation almost everywhere in the world. China is really buying many media apparatus, also using different tactics to manipulate the media in partner countries. Self-censorship of academia has already arrived to my university in Germany. I will talk about that if I have some time later, how China became very much censorship-oriented, even in Germany. And we can imagine if it is happening in Germany, also in the United States of America, what might happen in other fragile, weak, poor countries. We can imagine that. And of course, Chinese diaspora and other tools of inducements have been utilized as an instrument of Chinese sharp power politics. So indeed, in terms of the nature of Chinese regime, which is capitalist socialist combination, conduct and purpose of the actions through the mentioned threat and tools before, Chinese influence efforts are definitely sharp power rather than soft power, as those policies are implemented, orchestrated by an authoritarian regime, not by a democratic, open, transparent regime. All those exercised in a manipulative, coercive, and often covert way, and these geared toward infiltration and disinformation, with the aim of perforating the political and information environments in the targeted countries to sow confusion and discord, also undermine democratic values, weaken democratic countries, and strengthen authoritarianism at home in China. In those efforts to shape and create influence in other countries, we can mention especially there are many institutions, policies, strategies, but these are the most dominant ones. The United Front is one of those, is the integration of organizations under the Chinese Communist Party government into a comprehensive strategy aimed at controlling, indoctrinating, and mobilizing the masses, not only in China, but also in foreign countries. So the United Front is quite important and has already become part of serious disputes between partner countries. Also, Chinese student and scholarship associations on many university campuses have links with Chinese diplomatic missions, not only with Chinese diplomatic missions, but also, unfortunately, with Chinese overseas police stations. Indeed, a Madrid-based human rights campaigner, Safeguard Defenders, published a report recently saying that more than 100 so-called overseas police stations across the globe to monitor, harass, and in some cases, repatriate Chinese citizens living in exile. So, United Fronts, China Student and Scholars Association, Chinese diplomatic missions overseas, and finally, Chinese, unfortunately, police stations worldwide are in really very strong cooperation and communication with each other. So let me give you some concrete examples from okay, so one example, one bullying example is from the NBA in the United States over the Houston Rockets general manager's tweet criticizing Chinese pressure in Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang region over Turkic and Muslim minorities there. Another very harsh pressure was created on Enes Freedom, another Turkish player of the NBA at that time. He also criticized Chinese government because of human rights abuses in many parts of China as well as in East Turkestan. And also another example from Mesut Özil, famous Turkish German football player with Turkish background, who was playing at Arsenal at that time. He criticized the Chinese human rights abuses in Hong Kong, and also China immediately reacted. And of course, you know how China is reacting in those kind of situation. China says that we are going to stop our sponsorship, advertisement supports to those countries. And China decided not to broadcast NBA basketball meetings in China. So this would mean a very big the financial loss for NBA. Unfortunately, you see, Enes Freedom is not a basketball player anymore in the United States. Mesut Özil is not at Arsenal anymore. And also, there are really a plethora of international business from airlines to banks for listing Taiwan as a country. So this is very important. China makes very big pressure on international brands, international air flight companies to recognize Taiwan as a part of China, not as an independent country. If you do not openly declare it, all business relations would be immediately canceled. And it happened to also many other global companies. If you don't clearly underline that Taiwan belongs to China and it is not an independent country anymore. Also, the inducement of Hong Kong-based Cathay Pacific Airlines, this became quite a popular issue recently. It was a wake-up call revealing the danger of international companies operating under Chinese supervision. Also, I remember one more case from Yahoo's activities in China. You might heard about that. Unfortunately, Yahoo started to share private data of Yahoo's customers with Chinese government. So this is, of course, against international rule, the basic principles of communication, of course. But under Chinese pressure, Yahoo shared those information. And finally, of course, Yahoo lost the ground to other competitor companies because of lack of reliability in terms of protecting privacy of people. And recently, I have seen another report from Australia. The report says that China used coercive tactics 152 times since 2010 against 27 individual countries, as well as the European Union. However, there has been a significant increase in instances where China has used these methods since 2018. Another, of course, important point of discussion is related with the expansion of Huawei in the form of China's long arm in many European countries. At the beginning, European countries allowed Huawei to establish fifth generation infrastructure investment of Europe. The process started initially in Germany. German government, Merkel government indeed, allowed Huawei to establish fifth generation infrastructure in Germany. After that, Italy became part of this initiative. But when Huawei's long-term oriented strategy to become part of Chinese sharp power politics, and it became very clear that Huawei might undermine security issues of Europe. Huawei was finally excluded from Europe, and of course from many other countries who pays attention on democracy and human rights. Of course, in this Chinese pressure in Hong Kong, in Uyghur internet camps, also Chinese recent COVID-19 policies to silence entire society have become important indicators of Chinese soft power. Australia and Turkey are two important case studies indeed, but I don't have time to focus on them so much. But recently, the tension between China and Australia, because Chinese use of sharp power politics has created a really big turning point. Finally, it gave really big harm to mutual trade between the two countries. The import and export of crucial elements, rare earth minerals, strategic goods and services right now are mutually prevented. Also in Turkey, Chinese government done really big pressure in Turkey because Turkey has been the biggest diaspora of Uyghur Turks, more than, according to official statistics, more than 50,000 Uyghur Turks are living in Turkey, and China wants them to be sent back to China. And also there is a very critical oriented social media situation in Turkey. Also, political parties, opposition parties are criticizing Chinese policies, but China is making really big pressure in Turkey to silence opposition, civil society organizations, and urging Turkish government to send those Turkish people back to China. Otherwise, China warns Turkey that many investments will be stopped immediately, and China says it quite openly. Of course, China already lost many Nordic countries, including Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. mainly because of Chinese pressure also on those countries for criticizing Chinese anti-democratic implementations, mainly in Hong Kong and, of course, Xinjiang region. And the last one happened in Germany just 2 months before. Two journalists published a biography of Xi Jinping. In their biography, they have criticized Xi Jinping, but in the publication of this biography, Confucius Institute of China, as very well established at the body of many universities in Germany, wanted to prevent the publication of this book and academic gatherings and discussions on that book in different universities. Unfortunately, it became quite apparent that two universities stopped their activities. Two universities canceled their academic program discussing that autobiography on Xi Jinping. Finally, the issue came to my university because my university in Duisburg has the biggest East Asian Studies Institute throughout Germany, also in Europe. My university rejected to comply with Chinese arguments and decided to do such an academic activity and openly criticize China and Chinese government, Confucius Institutes. And after that, now in Germany, academic society is talking about the importance of academic independence, the independence of universities from the financial support of Confucius Institutes. So the same is happening nowadays in the United States as well. So let me skip some part of my presentation, and I would like to give some more time on the Belt and Road Initiative under Xi Jinping's strategies. As you know, the slogan of Belt and Road Initiative is one belt, many recipes, which means, yes, there are many models, many approaches. So China is not going to impose its own model of cooperation on the rest of the partners. And according to China, unlike the rule and contract-based Western order, Chinese indigenous offer evolves through memorandum of understanding for a win-win game along the Belt and Road Initiative. So as you see, memorandum of understanding is not a legal document. It is not a contract and rule-based document. It is something very flexible. So it evolves through unlimited bargaining process. But if you ask to Chinese side, there is nothing wrong with this memorandum of understanding because there will be mutual consultation, joint construction, and shared benefits. And the community of shared destiny with harmonious society is important. The term harmonious society I find very dangerous because it undermines the pluralism and different colors and perspectives globally. So harmonious society might be seen as sympathetic term at the beginning, but I find it very dangerous in the long term. Also, China talks about collaborative globalization, which is different from Western-oriented globalization. China respect for internal affairs and the regime type, and China respects sovereignty and equality according to the principles of the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is written in the textbook of Belt and Road Initiative. However, at the stage of implementation, we see a real phase of Belt and Road Initiative, which is related also with Chinese sharp power politics. So as the process of implementation has already shifted from attraction-based soft to a sharp power, So those sharp power politics are leveraged through the economic might of China. Those memorandum of understandings are improperly administered, and those caused concerns for a Trojan horse for China-led regional development. So in other words, through that non-clear memorandum of understandings, China has already infiltrated in many partner countries to create a national interest in those countries in favor of China against local, small, fragile, poor countries. Indeed, as a result of those improperly administered contracts, we faced with the problem of debt trap diplomacy in many countries. Sri Lanka has already bankrupted. Pakistan is at the brink of bankruptcy because of huge infrastructure investment from China, but the contract of those infrastructure investments are not clear, and they are bringing more and more financial burden on Pakistan. I can say that at the beginning, Chinese contracts along the Belt and Road Initiative are cheaper, but at the end of the process, they become really very, very expensive. Therefore, many countries focus on initial stage of those memorandum of understandings, but at the end of the process, they have to pay the cost. Also, there is a military expansion of China thanks to massive debt created in many countries. Also, huge infrastructure investment in poor African countries, also other countries in different continents. In return, China asked for military base, for instance, in Djibouti. So that means Chinese sharp power and Belt and Road Initiative are serving Chinese military expansion as well. Of course, there are Beijing-controlled institutions and transfer of, finally, strategic national assets to China. It happened in Pakistan. Pakistan transferred a very important national port to China because Pakistan failed to pay financial services. Also, Sri Lanka transferred an important national port to China for 100 years. So cheap, the so-called cheap Belt and Road Initiative projects are resulting in the transfer of strategic Gwadar port or other ports in the world to China, unfortunately. So the problem is that...
Can you wrap up in 3 minutes, please?
Yes, yes. The problem is that Chinese projects are very much complicated. Those projects concentrate in extraction, construction, transportation, and energy. So since they are very big scale, very complicated, without concrete contract, and since in these projects, global companies, multinational companies with transparency are not included, so those big projects are quite non-transparent, but authoritarian local governments are taking advantage of this perspective to get financial concessions from China and strengthen their authoritarian governments indeed. Therefore, Chinese perspective is good for authoritarian regimes, populist regimes, but those projects are bad for citizens, global stability, financial contagion, as in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And of course, it is opening way to political repression, migration, and climate change. So there are some important statistics underlining how Belt and Road Initiative implemented in the field. But I would say that almost 25% of Chinese projects are not open to corporate social responsibility measures or controls. Chinese companies, mainly state-owned companies, are controlling these projects, but Chinese companies do not disclose corporate social responsibilities indeed. And also almost 89% of those projects are funded by China, but China does not allow local participation as well as participation from other multilateral companies. Therefore, China is funding and China is implementing, the real advantage of those projects does not go to local governments as well as other global companies, but only to China. So my conclusion might be that in order to counterbalance Chinese sharp power, democratic countries need to work together to raise awareness within their entire societies. They should avoid economic over-reliance on China, which is happening in many countries. Formulate plans to fight disinformation and malign manipulation. Also reaffirm democratic values and enhance their soft power efforts at home and abroad. Of course, there are many policy takeaways from the implementations of the Belt and Road Initiative, but let me stop at this stage. And if there are some more questions, maybe I will find chance to return back to those presentations once again. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Ozturk. Yes, we can go back to some of these points in the Q&A session so that you can have an opportunity to expand on this. That would be nice. Now we'll move on to our second presenter, İmdat Öner, who is a former Turkish diplomat who recently served as deputy of head of mission and political officer at the Turkish embassy in Caracas, Venezuela. He's currently a senior policy analyst at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. He's also doing a PhD in international relations at the same institution. Over to you, İmdat.
Thank you so much, first of all, for this invitation and kind introduction. Let me first highlight that still 6:45 a.m. In the United States, so I haven't started my day with a presentation at such an early time. So if I say something dumb, please just excuse me. I also want to share my presentation with you. This is just part of kind of my dissertation. I know it might be boring with some segments, but I just want to highlight more the findings of the research that might be more enjoying. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you see my screen right now.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So this research or dissertation is kind of at the intersection of sharp power, disinformation, and strategic narrative. It focuses on Latin America because we have seen an increasing competition and rivalry between the major powers, United States, China, and Russia in this region. The importance of this region is significantly increasing in the realm of geopolitical competition. I don't want to just bore you with some nuances on my research, but how I came up with this research topic is because Latin America, the discussion in the great power competition mostly revolve around the material powers or material competition, which represent the military competition, economic competition, or investment competition. We see a different kind of the rivalries between these powers, but in the literature we don't see that much focus on non-material assets or the field, especially in terms of this sharp power issues, and one of them is media. Since we all know that this increasing importance of the discourse, narrative in international politics, the media competition or narrative competition in Latin America also becomes more relevant in today's politics. But in the literature, this side of competition is missing, although we see the media competition through the international broadcasting in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, or in Europe, even in the United States after 2016 elections. We don't have that much research in Latin America. So I decided to focus on this area, how this great powers use their international broadcasting to voice their narratives, to voice their discourse, and kind of shape the minds and hearts of the people. The first of all, the main thing, how we are evaluating this great power competition. And for that, I decided to analyze the official statement of the United States, because it is the existing hegemon in this region, and it's getting directly affected by the growing footprint of China and Russia in the region. So the United States start to show reaction, the rising kind of footprint of Russia and China in Latin America, and used more kind of an aggressive language in its official statement, starting from 2016. And of course, the rise of Trump in 2017 further complicated this scenario, and we see kind of more chaotic and disruptive narrative environment. And then, as we all know, this the famous quote of Joseph Nye, whose story wins rather than those whose army wins, right now is the kind of more centerpiece of international politics. So how you shape the people's mind and perception, then you kind of win the game. And also, we see a significant role of the antagonistic narrative in the media outlets in all around the world, not just used as a soft power or public diplomacy or just promote yourself, but also the undermine the other's core interest and influence. So my main research question revolves around three things: is how this strategic narrative becoming a factor in geostrategic competition, interaction between these great powers. Again, how this negative, disruptive narratives are used, strategically used in international broadcasting and social media outlets. And again, another segment of my research is, if any, to what extent there is a kind of a convergence, a confluence between Chinese and Russian media outlets against the United States in Latin America. My main hypothesis is, first of all, this great power competition intensifies and getting more escalates, then US, China, and Russia will be in a more a competition, a kind of through the confrontational narrative, kind of more disruptive narrative against each other. And I define it as a weaponization of narrative. And the second hypothesis related to the last question, if the United States increasingly labels China and Russia as threat to the United States, then these regimes, these countries will have more kind of a confluence and convergence in their respective national outlets against the United States. And I call it narrational convergence. So the main discussion, this already have been there during the Cold War. So what is the difference right now, right? This is the main question. So we all know that during the Cold War, we have kind of more limited communication strategies, and the literature mostly describes it as one-way interaction. Why? Because the radio or the newspaper just send the message, and then the audience maybe gets that or not get. But in the new source of interaction during the new propaganda era in today's world, we see two-way interaction. What it means, people are also part of this communication efforts, right? This news outlets share their news promote through the social media, and the people as the audience also joins this discussion through their Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. They comment, they share, they like. So this kind of communication becomes more, let's say, comprehensive, because there are much more actors involved in this two-way interaction rather than the Cold War era propaganda style. So in the literature, what we see mostly, international broadcasting was described as soft power or public diplomacy, starting with Nye, and then the call mentioned as a public diplomacy. So we see lots of discussion around the attraction or persuasion, change the perception to achieve foreign policy objectives. Or again, the famous quote, win the hearts and minds of the people abroad. That was the main idea of public diplomacy and the international broadcasting initially. Again, mostly used for the China and Russia. They were trying to break this Western-based communication monopoly. That was the reason that RT, CGTN increased their budget and increased their visibility globally. Another discussion in the literature, this international broadcasting recently became a disinformation or part of information warfare, because the boundary, the limit between this public diplomacy and propaganda is getting more complicated, because right now the international broadcasting is also used as part of propaganda, as I mentioned, as negative messaging or disruptive messaging. So you kind of mix both public diplomacy and also the kind of disinformation. Again, we know that through the trolls, through the some automated systems and designs in the social media, you can promote your information or your stories in a much faster and efficient way. The fake news, the conspiracy theories are more embedded in this in news and stories of international broadcasting. Again, as mostly sharp power discussion, I will also touch on that, but they try to solve doubt and complication, confusion in the political system and institution, especially in the democratic countries, to change the people perception. Another discussion that recently Christopher Walker came up with, this sharp power concept. He also gave a great speech in the series of this program, and he's mostly using this sharp power concept for the authoritarian regimes, that they are right now they have enough power to promote their the methodologies and the assets that they use in the domestic politics. They export it. They promote those stuff abroad beyond the borders. So they just don't want to win the hearts and minds through the public diplomacy or through the benign initiatives. They want to disrupt the system, because they want to give this message: if I am telling lie, you are also telling lie. So there is no reality. There is no any monopoly of a kind of fact in the media ecosystem. So they just want to disrupt this media ecosystem. And again, he mentioned that this eventually erodes democracy and democratic process at host countries. But one of the main the criticism of this sharp power is this is heavily focusing on autocratic versus democratic states. But now in this international politics, that the great power competition escalates, we need to just maybe put aside this autocratic versus democratic states and focus more on the strategic assets, strategic use of international broadcasting internationally. That's why I decided to use strategic narrative. This is one of the common the concept that rise in Europe, that Ms. Kuman described this as a kind of a mean, an asset for political actors to shape the behaviors of domestic and international actors. So rather than just using bombs and bullets in international politics, right now you can also use words and image to disrupt the other or the enemy. So again, as I described, this weaponization of narrative becomes part of geopolitical competition as a discourse power or narrative power. So how this international broadcasting is used in strategic narrative, I will show with more my findings. But right now, the main idea of this use of international broadcasting, just you don't use this international broadcasting as part of public diplomacy, just promote your benign image, your positive image, but also you want to undermine the other because the enemy is still there and you can use any means for your main goal, just, you know, to achieve your strategic interest. So, you know, independent variable, just rising rivalry and great power competition is independent variable, and my dependent variable is this narrative shift in the international broadcasting and state-backed media outlets. I don't want to just, you know, bore with this kind of nuances. Let me jump into my findings. So this research focused on Russian Sputnik Mundo in Latin America, CGTN in Espanol, and Voice of America, Voz de America in Spanish. And I analyzed the last 7 years from 2014 to 2021. I analyzed all the issues, the political crisis, political events in Latin America, and how those stories and events have been described and kind of shaped in the narratives of those, you know, state-led international media outlets. This first finding is from the Voice of America. So I decided to you know, analyze how China and Russia are negatively described and, you know, displayed in the, you know, the newspaper and the stories of international broadcasting, this Voice of America. Starting from 2013, we see, you know, especially after 2017, we see a very sharp increase in the negative characterization of China and Russia in the state-led media. You know, mostly we have a kind of an idea that this negative characterization or negative description was unique to authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. But my research shows that this is not just unique to those authoritarian regimes. I think this is the game, the nature of the game, the international politics, right? So if you have a strategic interest, strategic calculations, so you can use any means, and international broadcasting and media became a new tool in a toolbox that you can use to achieve your, you know, the objective, political objectives. So China and Russia are getting increasingly described as negative countries, negative, you know, powers in Latin America context. So the main overarching narratives as percentage of stories, mostly corruption and lack of transparency. Actually, Professor Ozturk also mentioned in his research that, you know, the corruption, lack of transparency was associated with Russia and China. And Voice of America significantly used this concept that how Russia and Chinese practices in Latin America are corrupted or, you know, lack of transparency. Again, we see lots of affiliation with China and Russia in terms of this disinformation and using fake news in their media or social media, supporting authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and also recently the weaponization of COVID-19 is one of the topics that Voice of America increasingly use after 2020. I provided kind of some sample from the rubric that I use. These are some, you know, samples that how this Russia and China are described with different kind of adjectives and pronouns in the stories. And mostly, you know, as you will see, Russian engagement with Venezuela or the Chinese investment and other sorts of engagement with the region is kind of more kind of deterioration in the governance, using the fake news or even the local, you know, voice that Venezuelan opposition criticized the Russian, you know, military aspect in Latin America. So we see kind of an increasingly description of both China and Russia in this region. The next one is about the Russia, how Russia Sputnik Mundo use negative stories about the United States. So normally, maybe I need to also give this description, but why I haven't used the China in the negative stories in the Sputnik Mundo, because I will leave it to the last chapter that I will focus on Russian-Chinese convergence, because I haven't seen any single one negative news about China in Sputnik Mundo. Whereas the Sputnik Mundo is increasingly using this, as you will see this trend, the negative message becoming a kind of a main a trend, even though they keep this, public diplomacy, the positive messaging about Russia is, used, but the negative message is much more prevalent in the statement or in the stories of Sputnik Mundo. Here again, the overarching narratives. The first thing, as a rising power, Russia wants to kind of promote its own benign image in Latin America as a great and growing capacity to solve the problems, not just in Latin America, but also worldwide. So tries to promote the Russian position in the region. And also, again, Russia is a reliable, benign partner of Latin America. It's not something that United States, use in its official or state-led media. Again, when we look at the state, Russian Sputnik's negative messaging, we see four overarching narratives. United States is an interventionist and oppressive actor in Latin America. US influence is weakening in Latin America while China and Russia are rising. United States is bad and Russia is a benign actor in the region, and the US weaponized the COVID-19. Again, you will see some sample, mention increasing, how United States is using military assets and, military aggressiveness in Latin America. In each political crisis, starting with Brazil, Bolivia, Venezuela, United States is behind all these political crises. The United States is behind the coup. And also United States is sending its own, military mercenaries to Latin America to disrupt and to undermine those countries and to interfere those countries. Here you will see, of course, when you look at the Voice of America versus Sputnik Mundo, there are kind of some more manipulated and blended with the conspiracy theories in Sputnik Mundo. Whereas in Voice of America, even though using more disruptive and narrative language, we don't see that much conspiracy theories. It's really hard to, understand which one is a conspiracy theory and which one is a real news. It's not easy to go into the root of those news to understand and analyze them. But from at least the tone of the speech and tone of the narrative, it gives us some clue that how those narratives are conspiracy related, or how those news have some root causes. And then again, it continues after the Trump came to power. We see more increasing usage of negative description, using again the sanctions against Venezuela. The Trump administration wants to invade Venezuela. Concerns, increasing over the U.S. militarization in Latin America, again, using Nicaragua, Venezuela, Afghanistan, the private wars of U.S. through CIA. So you see kind of more, this conspiracy theories in the Sputnik Mundo coverage. One of the, I think, most successful thing that Sputnik Mundo is doing, using local voices, because it doesn't, limit it to how Russia looks at the news in Latin America, but how the Latin American audience, how the Latin American officials describe the United States. And of course, using more kind of leftist and populist voices in the news. And for example, the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, directly using this kind of coup d'etat, and Evo Morales is one of the mostly frequently used commentator in Sputnik Mundo. Again, some left-wing party members, they describe, for example, any political events in Latin America as a coup sponsored by the United States. Again, another representative from Paraguay, or sometimes they are giving voice to the Latin American analysts, scholars from the region. So they try to give this image that this is not just unique to the, the Sputnik Mundo or the Russian discourse, but it is a reality that coming from the region, from different sources. Lastly, how the negative stories about the United States in CGTN. Again, when we look at here, what we see, CGTN is different from the Russian Sputnik Mundo, because CGTN is still using this positive messaging with respect to China, because China wants to increase its discourse power in the region. Tell the Chinese story well. This is the main idea for the Chinese administration. So they still use this positive, benign image for China in Latin America. But when we look at the trend of the negative stories, is again, skyrocketing. The main overarching narratives, similar to the Chinese, the Russian Sputnik Mundo, the responsible and generous great power in Latin America, especially too much focus on the Chinese donation, Chinese media, and so Chinese medical aid diplomacy in Latin America. Again, against the United States narrative, they use a kind of a counter narrative that China is a beneficial to the region, not a threat. Again, Professor Ozturk used that debt trap diplomacy that mainly criticize China in terms of this investment in the Africa or Latin America. United States is also increasingly using this debt trap label for China. But China is directly rejecting this accusation and saying that the influence of China is increasing and the investment of China is increasing, and this is very helpful for the region. Again, too much focus on the Chinese cooperation with Latin America in different areas, including space cooperation. And again, for example, they are giving the voice to the local names, like Vice President of Brazil saying that with the Chinese investment, the Huawei, the cost of technology decreasing in Latin America or in Brazil. Similarly, again, the Latin American expert comments positively on Chinese democracy. The Nicaraguan president praised Chinese development as an example for other countries. As you see how local voices also, portrays China as a, very positive example for the rest of the world. And China, when we come to the Chinese negative messaging, again, we see some sorts of similarities with Sputnik Mundo. US is no democracy. US is an interventionist hegemon, and US seeks to counter Chinese growing presence in Latin America. So not a democracy. Now you will see how the Chinese CGTN is aggressive in the tones that it used in the state-led media. For example, United States, which murders civilian with impunity, does not have slightest legitimacy to talk about human rights. This discussion especially increased after, if you remember, United States organized a democracy summit in the United States and invited several countries from the world except China and Russia. China started to broadcast and posted too many articles about how democracy is a pretext for the United States, and the United States doesn't have any legitimacy to hold kind of a U.S. democracy summit because U.S. is not a democracy. And you will see some example from again the local voice, the Latin American professors, how they analyze this U.S. summit, mostly using interference in internal affairs or using to serve the own interest. U.S. in interventionist power in Latin America, giving some example how U.S. involves in the domestic politics of Venezuela or Bolivia. And again, they are giving too much voice for the Venezuelan, Cuban, and the Nicaraguan officials. For example, one of them is the Venezuelan foreign minister says the U.S. Former foreign minister, state of secretary, has a criminal obsession with his country.
Can you
Again,
please conclude in 3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. I'm coming to the end. Again, we see how China is respectful in its relation with Latin America, whereas the U.S. is an interventionist. I want to show this quickly, this engagement metrics. We discuss how China and Russia or the United States shape this perception, but are they really successful to reach out to people? And when we look at this snapshot, we see how Russian Sputnik and RT are successful in Latin American audience. You see a monthly visit is over 22 million for RT Espanol, and Sputnik Mundo over 6 million, Voice of America 1.6 million, and Chinese CGTN is the weakest one in Latin America in terms of engagement. Again, when we look at the total visit share, RT is leading, and then the next one is Sputnik Mundo, Voice of America, and CGTN. And when we compare with for example, the CNN Espanol is one of the most, established media outlets in Latin America, is leading, but right after the RT and Espanol is coming. And when we look at, CNN Espanol has been there more than 3 decades, but RT just maybe have 10 years experience in the region. And Twitter engagement, again, one snapshot from my research, that RT and Espanol is one of the most successful and engaged social media accounts in Latin America. And that's far away from any other, even better than the BBC or CNN International in terms of number of retweets, likes, and other things. Of course, I don't want to, touch base on this, how automated trolls and other things are used in the system. But again, we see kind of an increasing audience in Latin America. Let me just shortly touch on this Chinese-Russian engagement and alignment in strategic narrative. I used soft balancing theory because soft balancing is a more kind of low-level efforts to get engagement to undermine the existing hegemon. So I decided to use this international broadcasting and strategic narrative as part of soft balancing. And when we look at, we see an increasing alignment against the United States between Russia and Chinese international broadcasting. CGTN is promoting Russian voice, and the Sputnik Mundo is voicing Chinese official statements increasingly. Again, in terms of COVID-19, for example, Sputnik Mundo clearly points to the Chinese official statement. And for example, the US finds no evidence to blame China. The coronavirus came from a US laboratory, not from nature. So when we look at this convergence, Sputnik Mundo is directly using several Chinese official statements. And again, this biological laboratories was mainly used by the Chinese officials, but Sputnik Mundo also promotes those news. And similarly, how Russian officials use this biological labs, or in the Ukrainian crisis, we see how Chinese CGTN is using them in its state-led media. Again, the sanctions, they get more alignment. China and Russia try to stop United States to interfere to Latin America. China and Russia are the protector of Latin American countries, especially poor countries or weak countries. China and Russia come to the rescue of Venezuela against the US offensive. So we see more kind of a convergence, both China and Russia in their respective. And another things that supports my hypothesis, as you will see, China is the most positively covered in the Russian RT and Espanol, more than even Russia when we look at the numbers. So we see kind of a clear alignment and promotion of each other in their respective media outlets. So as a conclusion, So as we move into the kind of a escalated great power competition, so we will see more kind of the control of narrative becomes much more critical, and we enter a new kind of an age that global communication competition, and we will see more kind of narratives and discourse will be weaponized at the hand of state-led media. This is not just unique to the authoritarian regimes, but this is, I think, the role of the game will be used by all sorts of political actors in international politics. And again, this chaotic, anarchic international environment will most likely will further ramp up the disruptive narratives in the future. Thank you so much for your time and listening.
Thank you. This was a great presentation. So we had two great presentations, and yes, we could speak for hours and hours on these issues. They are so significant and also deep, but unfortunately we have limited time. I'll start with a question to both of you. Sharp power, generally what we've discussed here is that it is when the authoritarian regimes do it against the democratic regimes. But as Imdat problematized it a little bit, it is not always the authoritarian regimes that interfere with the systems of others and try to interrupt their systems and institutions and so on. So I am asking both of you if you know any case of sharp power coming from democratic countries towards the others, towards other democratic countries or semi-democratic countries or authoritarian countries. And a question to you, Imdat, an additional one for you. You talked about the new media, social media, new technologies, digital technologies, and how now the information has become interactive, so news production, etc. So instead of just one party propagating its narrative or broadcasting, etc., there is this interaction with the audience. What sort of challenges and opportunities this new situation pose for both states, democratic or otherwise, authoritarian, but also civilians, activists, civil society institutions, and so on, and opposition? Thank you. Ibrahim, we can start with you, and then Imdat can take over. We can't hear you. You are muted.
Sorry, Professor Yilmaz, your question is a little bit beyond my presentation, I guess, maybe much more related to Mr. Öner's presentation. What is the direct relevance to my topic of interest? Would you please clarify that issue more?
Because you covered a lot of issues that what China has been doing, and maybe you can compare some of these things also have been done by democratic countries as well. So maybe you can make a comparison.
Yes, of course. Really, it was an issue that I have also been thinking about, that the similar strategies, economic policies, media coverage has already been done by the United States in the rest of the world as well. Why we do not criticize, let's say, the United States from the same perspective? All rising superpowers are trying to create influence in the rest of the world, but we are not criticizing the way Western countries are doing all those things. I think the dividing point is that China is not doing all those things through let's say, enthusiasm, positive motivation, through different tools of attraction, but China is using coercion, China using manipulation, China undermining institutions, organizations. This is indirectly abuse of sovereignty and independence as well. For instance, have you ever seen any academic gathering in any countries which is criticizing the United States, and you have seen a direct involvement from the US side to stop it? You see, this is the part of our daily language. Everywhere, every day, almost everywhere, we are criticizing the United States of America. We can say that America is an exploitive power, America invading many countries, and all those arguments are, people are free to do all those arguments, even in the United States, without any pressure. Any academicians in any US universities can criticize American perspective in the rest of the world. People are free to do that. But I gave you that interesting example from Germany. Even a very simple criticism of Xi Jinping in his autobiography, and the reaction from the Japanese consulate, from the Confucius Institute of China in Germany, that Xi Jinping is not a kind of person that can be criticized. He is not a normal politician. He is somehow God-given man. So you see, so the perspectives are completely different. American, you remember when we were young, we were all watching American films. They were very popular, but there was no enforcement for that, right? Because American movies positively motivated us. We were voluntarily following those TV movies. Also, we are drinking Coca-Cola everywhere in the world. Even in the least developed part of our countries, you can find Coca-Cola. But American companies are not making pressure on us to drink Coca-Cola. But in the case of China, for instance, an opposition party in Turkey criticized Chinese government of conducting many undemocratic pressures in Xinjiang region. As a reaction to a legal opposition party in Turkey, a reaction came from Chinese embassy in Turkey that party should be silenced immediately, otherwise we are going to stop many investments in Turkey. So therefore, Chinese policies are not related to mutual relationship, sovereignty, independence. They are not respecting those values indeed. So there is really direct or indirect violence, coercion, manipulation in the case of China. That is why these are completely different issues, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Imdat?
To some extent, I really agree with what Professor Ozturk mentioned, but I want to focus more on one point, that how China and Russia export their own authoritarian model to the rest of the world. We also see a kind of increasing trend in the world, that rise of far-right movements, rise of populist leaders. Especially when I was doing this research, I came across a couple of news, especially during the Trump administration, that Trump administration heavily criticized Voice of America not to be Voice of America, and try to manipulate the directory of Voice of America, try to change the leadership and make it more voice of his own maybe media outlet. But this source of engagement that we see in China and Russia might be replicated in other parts of the world in today's politics, because we are not more in a kind of democracy is the best model. There are lots of criticism. So most of the opposition members right now criticizing democracy and this liberal ideas. So that's why I think we are in the face of a challenge that eventually this authoritarian model, or kind of semi-liberal or non-liberal practices, will be rising in Europe and in the United States. So that is the main challenge. And I think the social media and the media is one of the main part, as for example, Trump, strategically used this media for his own benefit. and most likely we will see these kind of domestic practices in international politics as well, because the states describe this as a strategic interest. And if it is a strategic interest, if it is related to security, so then that can be used, this kind of manipulation in the language can be used, in the media can be used for my own benefits. So this is a kind of a rising phenomenon. And how we can, stop this, or what is the role of civil societies, or especially the tech corporate companies, right? After this Russian-Ukrainian war, what we see, Europe took a proactive step and stopped RT and Sputnik in Europe, and they couldn't broadcast anymore. And now same discussion happens in the United States. Some US congressmen urged, for example, Twitter, Meta, Instagram, other social media to stop Sputnik Mundo and RTN Español in Latin America, because US is also saying that they are disrupting the democratic order, democratic design in these countries. And now also the Sputnik Mundo and RT are broadcasting in the United States and also changing, and we see kind of more engagement with these media outlets. Right now, the United States, the audience also getting more inclined to watch Sputnik Mundo, the RT or Sputnik News. So this shows that the societies are transforming. The leaders, the opposition, or the political system is getting more non-democratic. So I think the more challenge face us. That's why I think my research is more relevant for the policy makers, that how the role of the game is changing, and the civil societies or the corporate companies should kind of mitigate this rising trend.
Okay, thank you, Fan.
Thanks, Isham, and thanks all two speakers. So really appreciate the informative discussion. So I think when we apply the idea or theoretical framework, China's influence as our starting point or as our theoretical framework, and I know that it's kind of theoretical framework like China's influence has been significantly popular among right-wing conservative political think tanks, for example, ASB, because that suits their own conventional narrative. So to some extent, we in the West, we otherize those countries and people coming from the country. And this kind of political divide can be translated into structural social discrimination at the policy level, at the immigration system. So how do you think, this is a question to both of our speakers, so how do you think that we can engage in such kind of debate with regard to China's soft power, sharp power, without politicizing the national and cultural differences, and without rendering those kind of debates into the normalization of for social discrimination? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, this is a very difficult question, and I have to say that I have no answer to that, because it is not easier to separate politics, politicizing the issue from, let's say, national interest or domestic issues in different countries. Really, I don't know, but in order to separate them, maybe as I recommended at the end of my presentation, we can define a set of values and principles to stick on. So based on those principles, maybe if we follow those principles, democratic principles, human rights principles, then on the basis of those principles, we can minimize politicizing of those issues, but really I'm not sure about if they also work, because, for instance, we talk about democratic principles, right? Human rights. Immediately you will get a reaction from Chinese side. What kind of human rights are you talking about? What kind of democracy are you talking about? We are doing things with Chinese characteristics because we have a different civilization. So the world is not composed of only by the West. So there are alternative civilizations, perspectives. That is why it is an imposition of China to accept a definition of human rights or democracy, which has been progressing in the West. So we don't need to share them. Therefore, it is very difficult to find a common ground between the two countries to stick on and make further discussion and reach and compliance, reliable communication. Really, I'm not sure about that. Indeed, I don't have a convincing answer for that.
İmdat.
And shortly, I can say it's really hard to answer this question, of course, because you cannot discriminate the domestic discussion from the international discussion, and the boundaries are right now are more kind of more interrelated. So you cannot discriminate or distinguish from one to another. But one thing maybe in terms of, for example, media, education is right now rising trend. So this might be a good way to educate your society, at least to get to achieve or to access to the real truth or the real information, not the fake one. I see some sorts of activities and practices in Europe in this way. They try to educate the society against the disinformation or fake news, at least from both domestically and also from outside. They try to, to stop this trend. The information is coming to you, you get exposed to that, but you don't know it's real or not. So especially with the social media and other things, you get more exposed to this source of the fake news, disinformation. The best way for the governments or for the states, try to educate their people, to educate their societies and population, so that they can at least show kind of an immune system to those disinformation. I think that is the only way that you can stop this.
Thank you. Herkül Bey? We can't hear you. You are muted.
Yeah. Now you.
Thank you.
So thank you for the presentations. They were interesting, and I learned a lot. I want to add something to what Professor Ibrahim said about the democratic and not democratic countries. I think the countries that are not democratic are less influenced by propaganda. They are safer because they control the mass media. So, I mean, it is the democratic countries that are influenced by fake news, for example. I think this is the big disadvantage of democracy, if you like, and the advantage of being not democratic. But I have another question, which is actually a rhetoric question. I don't expect, I don't think we have an answer to this, but I wonder how influential, how much does fake news and propaganda really influences societies? I wonder if they are really influential, and if they are, which part of the society is influenced? Is it the politicians, or is it the business people, or is it all the masses? How influential is the propaganda, and do we have studies about this? I mean, we know that, for example, propaganda increases, fake news increases or decreases, but do these things are really important? If they are not, what makes societies change opinion? I think it is a question that we have to think about. I don't think we have clear-cut answers to this, but maybe we give maybe a greater importance to propaganda than there may be other things that really play an important role in influencing the society and the opinions.
Any response, Ibrahim, Imdad?
Yes. I think this is a very crucial question. Thank you very much. But what I believe is that the negative repercussions of Chinese propagation through sharp power politics has been much more destructive in fragile, poor countries, non-democratic countries, as compared to democratic countries, because things are much more transparent in democratic countries. There is a very strong civil society, academically independent organizations. But the problem is that Chinese propagation is becoming much more powerful, destructive in developing countries, because mainly because of authoritarian populist governments. With the rise of multipolarity, and authoritarian governments are trying to isolate themselves from the Western influence, because Western countries are still making pressure on the basis of human rights, democracy, participation, etc. So authoritarian governments are trying to find new alternative markets, financial sources, infrastructure contribution. So by providing those economic contributions, China is trying to buy loyalty, political loyalty, in return for economic benefit. In that regard, it depends on the supply and demand conditions of those propagation through sharp power politics. What I'm trying to say is that in authoritarian countries, mainly with, through the authoritarian governments, there is really big demand for sharp power politics to be used for domestic politics. In that regard, it is becoming much more destructive and effective in developing countries. Nowadays in Turkey, let's say, people believe that Erdogan regime needs hard currency, but it is not coming from the Western countries through foreign direct investment or long-term oriented credits. So that is needed. But the propagation is that Western countries are trying to prevent the rise of Turkey. Western countries are preventing Turkey to become powerful again. But what an interesting is that China wants Turkey to become very powerful. And China helps Turkey. So this is a domestically produced infrastructure, environment, circumstances, which is attracting Chinese sharp power politics in Turkey. At the end of the analysis, I share your perspective. If there is no abuse of domestic situation by authoritarian politicians, governments, Chinese propagation may not be so much influential.
Thank you, Imdad. Any response?
Yeah, regarding the second part, I can mention now, is there any research, analyzing the audience is impacted by those, fake news or disinformation? There are several research, but there is no any unique response. Mostly they are saying, some of them are saying the audience are getting impacted by those disinformation, and the others saying, no, people already know that those are the Russian or Chinese affiliated news. So people are not getting so exposed to the idea that those state media promote. But the main thing that I see, they are not simply saying that, we are right or wrong. They are saying none of us right. So even the Western media outlets, they are not telling you the truth. So they are just giving this idea to the people, and they are just trying to change the people perception about the reality and the truth. That's why we are calling this post-truth world. And also what I see, Chinese and Russian media outlets mostly try to appeal the anti-establishment in those host countries, not mainly actually those right-wing or the US-friendly audience, but more kind of already have some questions about the United States or Western or liberal politics. Those people are getting more exposed to this kind of discussion. And let me finish with one anecdote. I met with a Cuban guy in Miami, in Florida, and he was talking, when I said him, I'm from Turkey, he started to talk about Erdogan, how he's strong, how he's powerful. He praised Erdogan. And I was so surprised, you are a Cuban. How did you get this information that Erdogan is a strong, Erdogan is a powerful leader? He was watching Sputnik Mundo every day. So this is kind of an idea that people are getting exposed, not just about China and Russia, but also, authoritarian, anti-liberal ideas are promoted and projected in these news outlets. So that's why people eventually, maybe they don't think Russia and China are good, but this maybe anti-liberal world or anti-liberal, the projection might be relevant for today's politics. That's maybe something that we need to think.
Thank you. Bülent?
Thank you very much for these eye-opening and insightful discussions and presentations. Actually, my questions was answered partially by both Ibrahim and Önder, but again, I would like to emphasize the importance of the issue because I maybe give another chance to mention some other dimensions. My questions originally is how do sharp power strategies of China work in Turkey and Europe? And this was partially answered by Ibrahim and Önder. And actually, who are the collaborators of these strategies to be successful, both in Europe and in Turkey? And how do these strategies gain a ground? We see that some European actors, very Sinophile, as they are Russophile, they also Sinophile. How could they find something from China to be market that as an attraction for European public opinion? Do you have an idea, Ibrahim or Önder?
Yeah, excuse me, we also have a question, an important question in the chat function. I'll read it. It is for Ibrahim. So if you can respond to Bülent in just 1 minute, each of you, then we will have time for the other question as well.
Although I am not expert on the issue raised by Bülent, I can say that democratic countries are much more vulnerable, fragile against China, because it is easy to make propagation in the Western countries. There is free media. Confucius Institute of China is using a huge budget to disseminate Chinese perspective at the universities, at the so-called civil society organizations, etc. So the floor is Chinese for Chinese. The platform is open. So if you do something legitimate, nobody would prevent you. But the opposite activities cannot be done in China. China is shielding itself from any kind of criticism activities, freedom of speech, but Chinese authorities can do that. Also, there is self-censorship as well here. If you are supporting university research projects, institutes, by significant expert as well as budget, so you are creating pressure on those institutions to keep silent. These are the agents, right? Universities, civil society organizations, media, intellectual platforms are the local agents through which China can create impact, influence, by the help of course, money. Many scholars are invited to China. Many scholars are provided financial support for the so-called research projects, etc. Maybe the similar policies have been used by Western countries as well, but the aim, the tools, and the outcome are completely different, of course. Regarding the chat question, Professor Yilmaz, he's saying that China is doing investment in many countries, in Singapore, in Pakistan, in Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of the world, where Western countries neglected so much. Western countries, for this or that reason, are not providing finance. They are not taking the responsibility, and there are really big investment deficit in many countries, and China is trying to accomplish those kind of investment. What is wrong with that? He is saying that. What might be the offer, Western offer, if there is no China effort there? Then what will be the offer of the Western countries? Indeed, this question is a legitimate question, but very sophisticated, very complicated question. In order to convince our audience by discussing on this topic, I need a really long time. But China is creating long-term oriented dependency. This is the problem. Yes, under the slogan of respect of independence, autonomy, sovereignty, etc., etc. Also, China says that we provide different financial support. It's completely different from Western approach. We do not put conditionality. We do not criticize fragility, risk elements, similar to the World Bank, IMF. So we provide easy money. This is Chinese perspective. But at the end of the day, almost 90% of projects are conducted, handled only by Chinese companies. All inputs are imported from China. All materials are imported from China. Machineries are imported from China. Companies are state-owned public companies. So this creates not only a financial dependency, but also this creates an unfair trade relationship. In the long term, by providing those economic benefits, China tries to buy political dependency, political loyalty in Chinese terms and conditions. This is my main point.
Not any response to Bülent's
Maybe answer
question?
the question of Dr. Kenesh. So the point that I see from the Chinese and Russian, especially the Chinese, both in Africa and Latin America, how they infiltrate and collaborate, or who are helping those. I think the main idea for the Chinese is just money buys everything. So they just promote their messaging, their narratives through buying newspaper, not just buying, but maybe paying them to publish their stories. What I've seen, several African, mostly read newspapers, again, same in Latin America, they are getting paid by China just to give some, voice to their messaging or their stories. So rather than those newspaper getting from the Associated Press or Reuters, they are getting the news from China. So in that way, in any African audience or Latin American audience, read the stories or message from the China's perspective rather than the US or the Western perspective. So I think that's the one way that they significantly use. And I think similar things happen in terms of those institutions under the universities or under the civil societies.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor Yilmaz, let me give you one funny, interesting anecdote from an African country, Kenya.
Okay.
So, as you know, China has established a really big infrastructure investment in railway investment, combining capital of Kenya to Mogadishu, two distant cities together, which is very much important for transportation, as there is a big port in Mogadishu. So this is a very expensive, very big size investment. So this is an ongoing project with a huge finance from China, which is constructed by Chinese companies, of course. So Kenya started to import some kind of fish from China, which is abundant in China, but Kenyan people are very much interested in that fish. They like to eat that kind of fish. I don't remember its name. But it was understood after a while that because of import of this fish from China with huge quantities, a local community which are dealing fishing, very poor local community, they are trying to cultivate that fish. They went bankrupt within a short period of time. A big number of people remain unemployed. the entire fish industry collapsed in such a poor community. Just because of that social, people started to demonstrate indeed there because they are helpless, unemployed, and that small, pretty poor industry has already disappeared. And as a reaction to that, Kenyan government put a restriction on the import of fish from China, just in that kind of fish, not every kind of fish. The immediate reaction from such a big country of China was that if you continue putting restriction on the import of fish from China, we are going to immediately stop that railway construction at the middle of construction, right? Which brings, let's say, $4 billion of investment there. The reaction, the scale, the content, the language of reaction is that. So Kenya is very poor, very small country. It is not possible to cope with China. When China enters from a door, then other doors will be automatically opened. A project is abused to open other doors to the interest of China also. And there is no international rule here. There is no legitimacy. There is no mutuality, etc. China is really using sharp power policies with the impact of hard power politics indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this. Thank you, everyone. This was the last of our Sharp Power Marathon. 6 weeks. We covered a lot of ground. We had 9 speakers in 6 weeks. They were all fascinating. We will, of course, continue to talk about these issues. These are all significant issues of our age. And we are planning to publish in one format or another these talks very soon as an ECPS publication, and also these talks will be available on our ECPS's YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Take care.